Well, a busy week in terms of the economy. We got the emergency budget from the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, tomorrow. Then those figures from Statistics South Africa that appear to show that unemployment was rising even before the lockdown and the coronavirus pandemic. Over 30% of people unemployed. The number of people with jobs in the formal economy now 16.4 million, whereas the number of people unemployed over 7 million. Ayabonga Cawe is our economic contributor here at Newsroom Africa. Ayabonga, good afternoon to you. I suppose in some ways, and I hate to put it like this, you weren't really surprised by the rise in unemployment. It shows us the trajectory we were on before the lockdown.
It certainly does. And afternoon to you, Stephen, and afternoon to the viewers. It does show us that the South African economy, even prior to the lockdown, had some challenges in labour absorption, but also in expanding production. And so these numbers are the last week of the lockdown, or they include the last week of the lockdown. And I think for a lot of us, even though they tell a sad picture, where we are now is probably a lot worse. Because if you consider that there's been a 4 percentage point increase in unemployment over the period, and if we put that into numbers, I mean, we're talking about a workforce of just under 39 million, and of those, just over 16 million are employed, over 7 million are unemployed. And I think for me the big concern is in the rise in that number of people who have stopped looking for work. So that's just under 3 million people who in the last 6 months or so have not undertaken the job search. And I think some of the big issues we're confronted with are going to have to do with getting more and more of those people to undertake the job search, but moreover, trying to improve the ability of our economy to absorb many of these. If we place it in a long-term perspective, Stephen, you, over the last 10 years, have seen an increase of just over 2.5 million jobs. And if you place that in a 5-year perspective, just under 1 million jobs have been created. And over the last year or so, there's been an increase of 91,000 in employment. But that does very little to absorb many of those who join the workforce every single year.
There were intense conversations around the economy long before the lockdown. We've been talking about it forever. In my view, those conversations have actually just intensified. We've been talking about the economy almost every day, despite the pandemic and because of the pandemic. Is there going to be a change of direction? Do you think tomorrow's speech by the Finance Minister could be the start of that change of direction?
Look, I mean, I think from the clues we've heard, I wouldn't see a path fundamentally different to what we've done. We've seen a commitment to fiscal consolidation, which is implied in it a reduction in non-compensation baseline expenditure. We also heard the Finance Minister talking to zero-based budgeting. So we continue along the path of fiscal consolidation and fiscal restraint, which I think for me is quite problematic if you're faced with the largest or the most significant crisis that we've seen since the Great Depression in the 1930s. So it's probably not the kind of wartime budget that we'll see. But I think the reality is that there will be some reprioritization of expenditure towards initiatives that are seen as contributing to the long-run growth potential of the economy. One of those is infrastructure. There will be a continuation of the social wage spending, be it through the social grants and many other measures. But we might also see, I think this is on the difficult side of things, some reductions in intergovernmental grants that finance infrastructure, the repair and maintenance of infrastructure, linked to key trading services like water, electricity, and some of our network industries, rail, road, and our port infrastructure as well. The big political contest, Stephen, you would know this, is, I guess, what happens to the public sector wage bill. In this context where we've seen wage cuts in the private sector, it certainly added to growing calls for there to be the budget cuts from a wage bill perspective that we saw in the February budget. But the big question is, there's a 3-year agreement in place, and probably not the best time you want frontline health workers to be thinking about whether or not they're going to get the cost of living rises or the above inflation increases that they believe is due to them. I mean, they signed an agreement in 2018, and yes, the context has changed, but I think that conversation has been very adversarial rather than a conversation that is premised on some form of, I guess, patriotic collaboration and partnership.
Ayabonga, if you were the finance minister, what would you do? We've already had Kasatu on Newsfeed today saying that they believe that above-inflation increase must be implemented because of the agreement. Bonang Mohale, you'll know him well, someone who spent a lot of time in South African business. Very much the other way around, and Bonang, I can look around for you, but there's no fence for you to sit on, I'm afraid. Would you pay the increases?
I would pay the increases as a commitment to an agreement that we'd signed. You would have seen the remarks around the number of legal challenges the government has had to confront. You don't want to add to that. You want, if you've committed in the medium-term expenditure period to these kind of cost of living adjustments, to do that, especially at this point where you're expecting people at great risk to their lives to go and work in schools, to go and work in clinics, to go and work on construction sites and elsewhere. I think I would pay it. But I think the big question, Stephen, about tomorrow's budget is, will it give us clues about the long-term economic plan of our country? And more importantly, I guess, on the expenditure side, how we're going to contain that. We heard Edward Kisweta speaking about just under 300 billion rand lower by way of tax collections, and that's going to have extensive implications for that budget deficit. We should be hearing now, what are the big long-term things that are going to be done from the expenditure side to make sure that we are on a sustainable path going forward. And the starting point of that isn't necessarily just your wage bill, but I think there are other elements that should be factored into that. And it might even be about reopening the debate on whether or not you need all of these different sites of state power, whether Parliament should be in Cape Town, the seat of the judiciary in Bloemfontein, and the executive arm sitting in Pretoria, and whether or not you should be co-locating these arenas, and in so doing, really realizing cost savings over the long run, rather than just short-term adjustments and reprioritization of expenditure.
Ayabonga, I would say there are a couple of things that the finance minister could do that might win him some political kudos in interesting ways. One is, just a suggestion, if I may, I would cut the VIP protection bill quite significantly.
Yes.
I would start, good, glad to see you nodding. I would strongly consider cutting the wages of ministers by up to half. I would cut the wages of MPs. I would also keep Edward Kisweta happy. I would double the tax on cigarettes. I would allow cigarettes to be sold, but I would double the tax on them, and I would double the tax on alcohol. All of that would get more money into the fiscus and buy political will from important role players in society, especially if you look at the arguments around cigarettes and tobacco.
Look, well, it probably wouldn't make you any friends, Stephen, among the smokers in our country, but I think the point is well made. What we're looking for here, Stephen, in my view, and I think this is what the marketplace is looking for as well, how do you allocate your increasingly smaller envelope of resources to things that can improve your long-run growth potential? So it's not just about allocating the money on the expenditure side to just deal with short-term operational issues like wages and the payment of grants, but for longer-term capital expenditure, how do you allocate that in a way that improves your long-run growth potential? I think that's where, for me, the difficult trade-off starts, Stephen. It's about taking money away, for instance, in your provisions for an ESCOM, and putting that into network infrastructure that will reduce the cost, for instance, of exporting through addressing some of the rail and port charges that we have in our country. That's the kind of structural message that all of us are looking for from this particular budget, rather than just, I guess, a short-term commitment to cutting some of those expenditures. Because you can cut them, Stephen, but then you're still faced with the same challenge in the next budget cycle or in the next medium-term expenditure period, where you might still have a bigger than expected deficit because of the scarring effects onto the economy and the economy not recovering, and so your tax revenue is not recovering. And so it has to be part of a coherent plan that says, here are the key areas that we want to prioritize and put our money where our mouth is. And we think on the basis of that in effect will be able, I guess, to pay off some of the debt we're going to have to take at this point, but moreover will, I guess, pay us back in much better than expected growth, much better than expected tax revenues, and hopefully much better lived experience for many of our people on the ground.
Ayabonga Cawe, thanks very much indeed. Looking forward, I'm sure we'll be chatting again tomorrow after the Finance Minister's emergency budget.